you are ready, then I will hit broadcast. All right. Good morning, everyone. My name is Dakota Harkins. I'm the Director of Education and Heritage Programming here at Lakeside Chautauqua. Thank you all for joining us as we are heading into our last day of week 9, our Lifelong Scholars Week, celebrating the 100th anniversary of the passage of the 19th Amendment. So this entire week, we've been focusing on the years leading up to and a few years after the passage of the 19th Amendment in August of 1920, which the anniversary of that was 2 days ago. And then on August 26th, sometime next week, we'll be celebrating when the adoption of the amendment was certified. So you have to tune in for those days too. But if you did miss any of our programs from earlier this week, Dr. Catherine Durack, Dr. Carol Lasser, and Dr. Catherine Jellison all gave us programs on everything from Ohio's role in the suffrage movement to suffrage along the racial line, and the original start to the suffrage movement in the early 1840s and 1850s. All of those programs can be viewed on our Lakeside Chautauqua calendar or on the Lakeside Chautauqua Facebook page. But for today's program, our focus this morning will be on the use of fashion in the suffrage movement, which is a totally different way of approaching it. So I am really excited to be have our speaker for this morning, Dr. Einav Rabinovitch-Fox. Dr. Rabinovitch-Fox is an instructor at Case Western University, and she teaches courses and specializes on women and gender history, American history, and then consumer culture and politics. So we are thrilled to be having her join us this morning. Welcome.
Thank you.
And I will turn it over to you now, and we can start the program.
Okay. So thank you, Dakota, for this nice introduction and for inviting me here. I'm sorry I couldn't come in person, but I guess this is as best as we can do right now. Let me just share my screen. So we will get started. I hope everybody can see me at this point and can see. Okay, so let's start. As I said, as we're marking the 100th anniversary this week, I'm really glad to be here and to, well, not really seeing you, but spending the time with you here. My talk today will focus on the use of fashion in this long struggle for women's suffrage and women's rights. And while fashion and feminism, in a sense, were always kind of like entangled together and was always on the agenda of the women's rights movement, it was only in the last stages of the campaign for the suffrage amendment, kind of like from the 1900s on, that the issue of fashion really kind of like came to the forefront of those struggles. So my talk will focus mostly on that today, but I do want to stress that it's not just that feminists consider and thought about fashion during that time. However, if we if we look at how feminists or women's rights advocates treat fashion in the 19th century, it is probably most remembered not by its fashion successes, but more of its fashion disasters. The 19th century, most notably Amelia Bloomer, that began as a dress reform initiative to promote comfort, more movement for women, kind of like the understanding that before we ask political rights, we need to be able to breathe and to walk and to do stuff, right? The very essential things in life. But that Just Reform initiative very soon became a PR fiasco for women who preach for suffrage. The media really took this image and use it to ridicule women, to ridicule the suffrage cause, and to really show the threat of suffrage for society, for the gender hierarchies, portraying suffragists as masculine, ugly, women that you don't want to, not want to marry, not want to be with. And that kind of like very, very harsh media attack caused suffragists like Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who originally adopted the costume, to really abandon it and to stick to more kind of like conventional fashions as they preach for suffrage. Well into the 20th century, the image of the bloomer, the negative implication of the bloomer kind of like haunted suffragists, and they were very much occupied in trying to counter this image and trying to find some more appealing, some more positive image that they can claim for themselves and not and kind of like to leave behind them this horrible incident that really haunted them well into the 20th century. But luckily for them, with the rise of mass consumption, with the rise of advertising and magazines and media, the early 20th century actually is a time where feminists construct a really different relationship with fashion. And they realized that in order to appeal to men, that's what, to give them the vote, because they didn't have it, right? Men had to vote on it. They need to cultivate a more appealing image, and fashion is actually, it was a good way of doing it. As one suffragist told the Tribune reporter in 1911, and now the latest move concerns the clothes questions. It is a personal affair with most of us, but frequently hinted by the big leaders that the dress question is maybe the most vital of all. The suffragist hereafter is to be the leading exponent of fashion. Each and every one will dress as she never has before. It's all been planned and agreed to, signed and sealed. So really, they understood that they kind of like need to change their public image, and this new attention to women's appearance and the insistence that suffragists can be and are fashionable women, that there are not those ugly masculine bloomers, but they are feminine, they're beautiful women, really marked a change in the campaigning strategy. After a decade or so of facing real impediments for the embracement of the franchise, suffragists decided to kind of like go at it, right? They were very kind of like media savvy and advertising savvy, and they began utilizing all kinds of spectacular and theatrical tactics, such as parades and picketing the White House and walking and doing all kinds of pageants and talking and speaking tours that really pushed the issue of suffrage both onto the media, but also into the public discourse. And fashion, of course, played a crucial role in popularizing these tactics and in shifting public opinion. By adopting the mainstream styles of the period, suffragists were able to use fashion as a political tool and as a campaign tool, which was now, which at the time was very innovative and very new although today we're kind of like, well, of course, this is how we run political campaigns, but really this attention, not only to the message that you're trying to say, but how you say it, was really something that suffragists began to put more attention to. And they realized that, we can use fashion to our favor, and we can really utilize it to advocate our cause. And they kind of like thought that if they would use attractive women to sell their image and to sell their message, the public would be more acceptance of what they say. So suffragists really emphasize the importance of cultivating a feminine appearance and less threatening, right? Not like this bloomerites that were so scary. According to Dr. Hannah Shaw, who was the leader of the National Women Suffrage Association, that meant avoiding every attribute or behavior that could associate one with the freaks, the way that the media portrayed the bloomers, the short-haired woman, the long-haired men, the woman who smoked, played bridge, anything that kind of like said that women are not feminine, right? And only in this way, Shaw believed that suffragists could manage to succeed. Another activist confessed that the mannish-looking suffragist had done more to hurt the cause than anything I know of. Our salvation will be in the effeminate woman, the average woman, she said. So really kind of like using images of beautiful women in the media. And that's exactly what suffragists did. They started to disseminate in newspapers and magazines the feminine charms of the woman militant, right? Although we ask for suffrage, although we walk in the street, although we do something that are not that conventional behavior for women at the time, look at us. And all those articles talked about how good mothers they are and how wonderful cooks they are and how beautiful is their home and their great homekeepers. So even if many of these suffragists were young, were not married, did not have children, in those images and articles, there was a lot of emphasis on the fact that they are mothers or good sisters or good daughters, and not, and kind of like, that's what they emphasize to show that, asking for suffrage doesn't mean that we are those crazy bloomers. And really the claim that suffrage had the power not only not to diminish, but to enhance one's feminine beauty became a really strong strategy at the time. Suffragists believed that they could celebrate their femininity and also claim political rights. Suffragist Lydia Commander declared that women were determined to take an active part in the community and look pretty too. So that was kind of like what they were getting at. And suffragists used two arguments for getting the vote that were kind of like in contradiction with one another, and yet they kind of like used them both throughout the campaign. One was that they deserved the vote on the base of their equality to men, right? Men and women are equal and they deserve equal right. But in the last stages of the campaign and more into kind of like the 1910 and onwards, suffragists also argued, well, you know what, we need the vote because we can bring something else to politics as women, because we're different than men, because we are as housewives, as mothers, as the ones who are in charge of morality in society. We can bring into politics this component, we can clean up corruption, we can feminize politics, and this is why we deserve the vote, because we're different from men, because we can bring this extra thing. And the use of fashion really played into this latter argument that here, look at us, we're beautiful, fashionable women, and hence we can bring those qualities of attention to style, attention to beauty into the political system, and this is why we deserve the vote. And luckily for suffragists, at the time, fashion styles became very suitable to the message that they tried to convey. So by 1908, the year which suffrage parades began, a new style came into fashion that were much more simpler, much more narrower than the previous fashions of the S shape, famous silhouette of the 1890s. Those styles reduced the circumference of the dresses. They had shorter hemlines, and suffragists could felt comfortable to claim these fashions because they really convey ideas of rationality, of modernity, of simplicity that was very suitable to the message that they want to present themselves as new women, as citizens, right? That was very different from the traditional associations with fashion that is usually frivolous and it's, uncomfortable, right? And not useful. Those new fashion were actually better suited for suffragists, so they didn't have to feel that they need to invent an alternative fashion of their own, but they could just go ahead and use the popular styles. But with that, and kind of like when they adopted these styles, they could also show their fashion sense, right? And countering this myth that they are masculine or unattractive. But on the other hand, they present themselves, look, we're dressing like, the latest fashion, the latest style, and we are beautiful. And that allowed them to really play with that message and the emphasis on femininity. And fashion also enabled them to say, you know what, each of us had this own individual taste, right? We're not, despite the fact that there is a sense of conformity when we talk about fashion, they really emphasize the fact that, we're not wearing uniforms. We're not just gullible creatures who go whatever the fashion is, but each and every one of us is cultivating our own individual taste, right? And that kind of like meant that as citizens, they will cultivate their own independent opinion. And again, playing on that thing that they are worthy for the vote. In a message to marchers in 1912, for example, Harriet Stanton Blatch, who was Elizabeth Cady Stanton's daughter, announced that wears a white or a light dress or a small hat are desirable, they're not obligatory. Arguing that the large numbers of marchers are more important than the uniformity of dress, Blatch went further and claimed that any regrets some may feel for the lack of uniformity should be awaited by the thought of that distaste for conforming may be but a promise of an independent and a future voter. So really honing kind of like the fact that we are dressing fashionably and each woman dresses according to her own taste, that's a proof that we can be a really useful citizens if we get the vote. And while suffragists never adopted one style or another, there were things that they liked better. There were styles that were a bit more popular among the suffrage ranks. And one of them was the tailor suit, or the tailor costume, as it came to be, because again, it conveyed both practicality and respectability, which are definitely the qualities that women wanted to convey. And the industry kind of like picked it up very quickly, and realizing, oh, here we have kind of like an opportunity to gain also a profit. So in 1910, the American Ladies Tailors Association came up with their own version of the tailored suit and marketed as the Suffragette Suit. And that suit contained a plain shirtwaist under a short jacket and a divided skirt. So a divided skirt was maybe a bit more radical item of fashion. I remind you again, the bloomers, and kind of like alluded more to the bloomers. But by the 1910, divided skirts were kind of like a more common sight due to bicycling, the popularity of cycling, and so it didn't seem like this radical fashion or something like that. And suffragists really kind of like adopted it. It was nice, it was practical, it was useful for them. But what really made the suit a suffragist suit was less the fact that the skirt was bifurcated, but more that the suit contained pockets, and plenty of them. And pockets were considered to be a utilitarian component of clothing, and they were used in the walking suit before suffrage, but by the 1910, pockets are really become associated with the struggle to the vote. The suffragist Alice Duer Miller had a column entitled Are Women People, in which she kind of like preached for suffrage. And in 1914, she published a short piece titled Why We Oppose Pockets for Women. And in it, Miller mockingly detailed the anti-suffrage arguments, substituting the word vote in pockets, really to show how crazy it is, right? Because pockets are not a natural right, because it would make a distinction between husband and wife as to whose pockets were to be filled, right? And showing this absurdity of doing it, but she using the pockets, because by that time, pockets really become kind of like a symbol for women's suffrage. And every outfit that really contained pockets, not just the walking suit, but a dress, a coat, a gown, everything that had a pockets in them, a visible pockets, was deemed a suffragist costume. So that association was definitely not coincidental. And they use it as a way to kind of like advertising. And it's a way also to show your support for the cause, right? If you're wearing a dress with pockets, you are a suffragist, even without wearing banners and anything else. And suffragists really liked that tailored costume, or the suffragist costume, because it provided them a lot of convenience and a lot of mobility that was important to them. Not just the circumference of the skirt, but the short hemline. And I know that for 2020 people, this hemline does not seem very short, but it was a big a big improvement considered to the trailing skirt. So a mid-calf hemline was an improvement. And it turned marching in streets and these type of spectacles to a much more comfortable and feasible experience. Suffragists could walk in a few miles in dirty streets and streets in the beginning of the 20th century were much dirtier than they are today, without the fear that their dress would get dirty or wet or become a health hazard. That was a concern for women. And marching costumes, as the one that you see here, that were comprised of a tight pants underneath a skirt with a deep slit, really enabled suffragists to walk in those parades without feeling uncomfortable. And while this suffragist kind of like have a more daring pose with her leg and kind of like showing off her pants, when she walked in the street, the trousers would be invisible. So she wouldn't get any negative reactions from the crowd. She would just look like a respectable woman walking, demanding her rights. And that was a way to kind of like go over the kind of like the bloomer association. So while she had pants, she was not a bloomerite, right? She was a beautiful marching woman. So, and again, despite the fact that there was no kind of like one suffrage style or one suffrage costume that suffragists really were known for, that enabled them to kind of like show support more easily. I mean, they could just wear a white dress or a white blouse, adding a button maybe, or a certain accessory in a color, in a certain color, and then they can show their support for suffrage. And while the suffrage press did kind of like advertise clothes that they, the suffrage blouse, that was the same blouse that you can just go to a department store and buy one. What made that suffrage blouse was not really the style of it, but more of that reclaiming of fashion and saying, this is mine. Suffragist Elizabeth Newport Hepburn, for example, explained that many of us buy our frocks at department stores, and special suffrage regalia is not, alas, a specialty of these stores. So really, again, they could show their support and they show the solidarity through this use of fashion, but it wasn't kind of like a specific place that, or a specific outfit that they had to buy to do that. And that enabled them also to expand the base of support for their constituencies. The only garment that was kind of like a suffrage uniform was a replica of a prison dress that the National Women Party activists wore during their time in Up One workhouse in Virginia, when after they began picketing the White House, they also began to get arrested and jailed, some of them for periods of a few months, some of them for a few days, and they resisted their arrest. They demanded to be political prisoners. They went on hunger strikes. They were force fed. A whole shebang of how women were actually violently demanding for the vote. And while at prison, suffragists kind of like rejected the prison dress. They didn't want to be associated with it because they said, we're not prisoners, we're not criminals, we are political prisoners. By the time they go out, they really use it and kind of like harnessing it to show the victim, kind of like playing a little about the victimhood and showing their loyalty and sacrifice for the cause. So in 1919, 2 years after the jailing began, the NWP organized a cross-country prison special tour, right, where prisoners dressed in those replicas went all across the country explaining and telling their experiences and calling for suffrage. And by turning this prison garb into kind of like a fashionable dress, even though it was a prison uniform, they stripped away the connotations of criminality. Also, and that's not a good point to them, but also the association with poor and Black and brown people who were the majority of prisoners at the time, right? So they're claiming it. Most of them were white suffragists. So by wearing it as a source of pride, they also kind of like stripping away those racial connotation with the dress and really making them a powerful political statement. But clothing and silhouettes and styles were not the only way that suffragists used fashion to push for suffrage. Color was, of course, another major aspect of it. And as Glenda Tinnen, which was one of the organizers of the famous Washington, D.C. parade in 1913, claimed that an idea that is driven home to the mind through the eye produces a more striking and lasting impression than one that goes through the ear. So really kind of like using color schemes that really caught the eye, that were also good for photographs and posters, was really kind of like began to be used in the campaign. As I said, they were very media savvy for their time, and in general even, and they really knew how to kind of like play with that to push for the demand. So, for example, the Washington DC parade was organized, the order of the marches was also organized by color. Students wore green, writers wore white and purple, social workers wore dark blue, really creating this harmonious and very powerful visual image. But the use of color had another additional effect. And through this use, again, of color, of organization, of embroidery talents, right? Suffrage managed to assert their political presence in what was considered to be a male sphere, right? And this photographs, I think, really show the great kind of like use of color that suffragists made, this contrast between men and women, the men in the crowd who are dressed in dark suits, between order and disorder, right? Between beauty and talent to this chaos that's going on in the viewer, really kind of like push the message that look what we can bring to politics. Look what we can bring that you can. And that if you just give us the vote here, that's how we're going to clean up politics. And really kind of like hone the message, the suffrage message that they tried to convey. The use of color also helped suffragists to build their brand, right? Their understanding they need to sell politics, what we are probably doing today, but for that time it was really an innovation. And they realized that it's not just that they need to create this beautiful image, but they also need to create a recognizable marker, right? That those colors will be associated with suffrage. And these are the American suffrage colors. Yellow was a long time suffrage color ever since Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susie B. Anthony used it in their campaign in Kansas in 1869. It was a failed campaign, but they used the sunflower, which is Kansas state flower, in that campaign, and that color kind of like sticked. The National Women's Party, when they embraced the suffrage color, these are taking and being inspired from the British suffragettes, which many in the NWP got their first kind of like suffrage activity while they were in Britain. The British colors were purple, white, and green. And in America, Alice Paul changing it into yellow, again, as a tribute to Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and using them as a suffrage color. The colors stood for loyalty, purity, and hope, respectively. And as you can see, even in the publications and posters and things like that, they are continue and working with this color scheme again to create this recognizable marker. As I said, they were very media savvy. After suffrage, many of them will go into advertising, really, because they realize how to sell products. But at that time, they're selling suffrage in many ways. And the use of colors, as I mentioned, also enables activists who were maybe excluded from the mainstream movement due to their class or to their race, also claimed a stake in the cause. Because there was no special suffrage costume, a suffrage regalia, and each woman could just buy a dress and claim it as a suffragist, it enabled more people to join the cause, especially for African-American suffragists. The use of color white was really important because it stood for purity, because it stood for moral kind of like respectability, that were qualities that were long deprived for African-American women in public discourse. And that was a way for them to claim not just equal part in the suffrage struggle as an equal participants in the cause, but also to claim their equality, their racial equality, their humanity, their being respectable women as Black. And despite the criticism that many of them had on the mainstream suffrage movement that was elitist in its view and racist in its view, the color white, they would manage to kind of like harness them to also promote their message. By dressing like their white counterparts, right? We're dressing just like you, and this is why we're equal to you. This picture of Ida Wells walking in with her Illinois delegation, that's our only actually photographic evidence. Black women were supposed to march at the back in that parade, in the 1913 parade. Ida Wells refused. She wanted to walk with her delegation, and she really integrated the parade by joining the delegation from the crowds. She refused to go in the back, and looking like her white counterparts, I really created this image of solidarity, of joinment in the cause, right? Which many African-American women, despite the fact that they were marginalized, despite the fact that they were never welcomed into the mainstream organizations, felt, the cause is bigger than the people, and we need to kind of like join the cause despite the racism and show our solidarity. And that unity of colors, this unity of fashion, had the potential of creating that solidarity and to show here we are this is our plea as women, no matter what our race is, no matter what our class is. However, as powerful as fashion can be, right, it can kind of like overrate the really strong biases within the movement and within many of the suffrage leaders that kind of like did not want to give an equal position for women, for Black women or for working class women in the movement. But if color failed to create this, you know, cross-class and cross-race solidarity, it did help in popularizing the cause and into transforming the public images of suffragists in public and in the media. And by 1915, it looked like that, at least on the fashionable front, suffragists could claim a success. An editorial in the Century announced that in the campaign for women's suffrage now being waged in New York, it has been observed that suffrage speakers have a conspicuous advantage over their opponents in point of personal charm. That in fact, the anti more often look like the strong-minded suffragist of caricature than the suffragist does, right? And thinking about how trying to get away from this dowdy, masculine-looking suffragists and presenting themselves as women also helped eventually to turn their victory into a constitutional amendment. And here you see Alice Paul raising a glass when Tennessee became 2 days ago, 100 years ago, the 36th state to ratify the amendment. But in this process of kind of like shifting their public image, they also formed a positive connection between fashionable appearance and feminist ideas, and marked a new relationship between feminism and fashion that saw fashion not as something that you need to ignore or as a problematic issue, but something that you can really harness and be part of the agenda for women's rights. And of course, that the use of clothing in the service of promoting political agenda and ideas went beyond kind of like suffragist very successful campaign. So in the 1920s, women utilized the flapper fashion to express their sexual freedom, their independence, turning the clothes into the visual symbol of this liberating lifestyle that they promoted. In World War II, clothes still maintain kind of like their political meaning. The tailored suit, right, and the tailored look continued to be popular, especially as women went in more and more into the war mobilization, into working in factories and into the public sphere. But when we talk and we think about suffrage fashionable legacies, no doubt is the color scheme that kind of like had the more powerful and lingering effect. Women, and especially women politicians who wanted to break new grounds in role of government, really use the suffrage color, and especially white, in reference to the suffragists when they campaigned for themselves. Shirley Chisholm, for example, who was the first African-American woman to be elected to Congress and the first African-American woman to run for president, as in a big party, used the color white. She got sweared into the Congress wearing white, again as a symbol and a reference to suffragists. Chisholm herself kind of like used fashion. She had this, again, very recognizable marker with her hairdo and her cat eye glasses that really kind of like pushed her image as unbought and unbossed. And really, she was very clever in how to use fashion to claim both her respectability, but also her femininity and her kind of like celebration of Black culture and of political determination. Other politicians, of course, also used fashion, most notably Hillary Clinton in the last election, who also managed to kind of like take the pantsuit and make it a really visible marker, both of her campaign and her political agenda. She also famously wore white to her acceptance speech in the DNC, again referencing the suffrage heritage. She also used fashion in really cleverly ways. She made connections with the fashion industry, again, to show herself, like the suffragists, of how she is feminine, right? And she's kind of like a fashionable woman. She's trying to create a less threatening image, a more kind of like up-to-date image that appealed maybe to young voters. And the campaign had a runway show where famous designers from Marc Jacobs and Tory Burch designed clothes and t-shirts with campaign slogans, really turning the political message into a fashion statement. And so people like Women's Rights or Human Rights or I'm With Her really began to be kind of like a fashionable thing. And the use of clothing also, I think, just intensified since the election and Clinton defeat, whether it's through the use of pussy hats in the campaign, but also really came into the runways and the high fashion side, notably Dior and other Missoni, other big fashion houses kind of like endorsed those feminist message. And the color white still reverberates in our political system. So for the last two consecutive State of the Union address, Democratic senators were appearing in white, again, specifically referencing the suffragists. And in 2018, in what is now we have the most diverse Congress in history, many of the newly inducted congresswomen also choose to wear white in their swearing-in ceremonies. And AOC, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, even again referenced the suffragists specifically. I wore all white today to honor the women who paved the path before me and for all the women yet to come. From the suffragists to Shirley Chisholm, I wouldn't be here if it wasn't for the mothers of the movement. So again, this continuing legacy through the color white, through fashion, is something that we can really pinpoint from back 100 years ago, right, up until today. And this recognition that fashion not only has the power to convey a political message, but also is really becoming part of the political vocabulary that is not just kind of like this something frivolous in the campaign, but something that you can really utilize in a very clever way. Nancy Pelosi is a great example for a woman who really used her dress in very cleverly, and really, and that really become kind of like part of our political culture. And I don't think it will go away anytime soon. However, well, fashion statements, no matter how good they are, could never really replace the power of a well-organized activism. So, you know, don't just wear a white suit to the polls, actually go and vote, or, you know, if you're going to the post office when you're mailing, just wear white, I guess. But whatever the fashion statement is, right, if they march in their white dresses in 1913 or in the pig pussy hats in 2017, it really is the creative use of fashion that enable us and enable activists to shape a new feminist presence in the street and in public discourse. And understanding this power of fashion, I think, enable us not only to understand the past, but also to think about the present and the future. I don't know what will be the feminist uniform of 2020, but I think it's a good way or a good place to start. And I will end my talk with this, and I look forward to questions. So thank you.
Well, thank you. That was a lot more than I've ever known about the different styles and colors and everything that could be used. So that was fantastic. We did have a couple questions come in. David Blank had a few on Zoom, and he asked if you could extend your discussion of fashion to prevailing hairstyles. And plus we see a lot of hats and other headwear. Can you provide any comments on that feature as well?
Sure. So hairstyles of the time were kind of like those big chignons, where it's only in the 1920s that women will start cutting their hair, which will also be a big thing and would be seemed so radical. You don't know how many words have been wasted on and how many people thought that is the end of civilization, that women are wearing a bobbed hair, or that women no longer have short hair, no longer have long hair. But suffragists themselves didn't go that radical, partly again because they really were afraid of portraying themselves as too radical. The short-haired woman was kind of like a marker of a radical, of an extremist, and that's something that suffragists really didn't want to be associated with. Hats are an interesting thing because at the beginning of the 1910s, or at the beginning of the 20th century, they're really big. And they're also causing a lot of public debate, partly because the custom was that women should not take their hats off when they entered the building, unlike men. So in movie theaters and theaters and other kind of like public events, if you think of a woman who wear a really big hat in front of you and kind of like blocking your view, that caused a lot of kind of like social anger. But in a sense, it was also a way of claiming, look, I'm taking public space, right? So the bigger the hat, that's you couldn't be ignored anymore, right? And the shift to kind of like more narrower hats and smaller hats is really coming again by the 1920 when we have the open cars who become kind of like very popular, and the closed fitted hats are really great to keeping even your short hair from flouting in the wind. So we do have and already, I mean, you know, so we do see kind of like a process of shortening of the narrowing of hats, but it also, you know, women now has the vote in 1920, so maybe they don't need a big hat to announce their place anymore.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's interesting. Just a little side note for Lakesiders. One thing I always thought was fascinating when I looked at the history of our auditorium here. We have a large 2,600 seat auditorium that was built in the late 1920s, but they actually blasted out some of the bedrock headed towards the stage to create more of an incline because of women's hats that they would wear to the programs. They would block everyone's view if it wasn't at an incline amphitheater style. So I always thought that was amazing. I never thought about wearing hats to programs, but it was definitely part of the fashion at that time. And then David had a follow-up question too. Could you discuss the impact, if any, of the suffragettes' fashion on men's fashions?
It's an interesting question. It's a good question. I would actually argue it's maybe the reverse. So again, as clothing style for women become more simpler, and even the tailored suit, it's kind of like a take on kind of like the more masculine suit. So you see women's fashion adopting more masculine elements into their style. So it's not the influence, I think it's more men fashion and women fashion than the vice versa. And even a clothing item like a shirtwaist, which was basically the female version of a male blouse, is kind of like, and again, thinking that male clothing are much more rational, are much more functional, right? They are conveying this ideas that women fashion usually do not. So suffragists were more welcome to adopt these type of elements. You see a lot of the popularity, for example, of ties, of kind of like more masculine fedoras, if we're talking about hats, that they're taking kind of like, they're having this female touch to it, but they are definitely taken more than to kind of like to be similar to men. So I wouldn't say that male clothing became more feminized, but actually that female clothing became a little bit more masculinized in that regard.
Mm-hmm. That does make a bit more sense, that direction. Well, we don't have any more questions for the moment, but a couple of reminders before we let everyone go for this morning. Dr. Rabinovitch Fox will be back this afternoon to talk about all the commemorating of the suffrage movement and the 100th anniversary that's been going on. And then as another reminder, she is currently writing, as far as I know, still writing maybe, a book about the topic that she went over this morning, and the title of that is Dress for Freedom, American Feminism and the Politics of Women's Fashion. So just to put a plug in there for that, maybe we'll hear about more of that in the future, but just so everyone is aware. But thank you all for joining us this morning. Thank you for your questions, and thank you, Dr. Rabinovitch Fox. We will see you this afternoon.
Sure.